I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. The secret to great creative work isn't just the idea, it's knowing how to get there. Toby Wilkinson, co-founder of Ask Us for Ideas, has spent the last decade helping brands navigate the messy world of agencies, briefs, and creative partnerships to make the process smoother, smarter, and more successful. My interview with Toby is coming right up. But first, Toby Wilkinson, welcome to On Brand.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nick. It's very nice to be here.
So I have to ask, as we talk about the creative process, naming is one of the trickier parts of that process. And I'm always confused, or not confused. I am fascinated when a interesting name comes across my email inbox. So how did you and your co-founder come up with the concept of Ask Us for Ideas? Because I'm imagining you probably had some folks asking you for ideas.
It's a good question. We laugh a bit about that story because I wish there was some sort of really nuanced and poetic reason that we land on that name. But truth be told, the truth to how we landed on the name we did, which we've come to love and is very much part of the fabric of the business, and you referenced it there. When Nick, my co-founder, Nick and I, for a bit of context, Nick and I have been friends since we were 13. So our relationship is one of friendship first and business second. When we were starting this business, and we started this business when we left university. So it was this is our foray into employment. And neither of us have a hugely rich background to tell before this business. We were actually working out of my family home at the time. And my father, who was a sort of natural advisor to us, just based on the fact he was my father, sort of peered over our shoulder at one point and to ask us what we were doing. And I think at that point we were trying to find the name and find a URL. And I think he made some comment about, I wouldn't worry about that too much at the moment. You don't even have a business plan. I would just lump for the first thing you could go for. And then if you come up with something better in the making of it, then you can always change it. But I'd worry about the meat of the business ultimately first. And so we discussed Ask Us for Ideas as a name, and neither Nick or I hugely loved it. The reason being actually because at the time in the UK, and I'm sure there's very similar things in the US, and this company still exists. There's a company called We Buy Any Car. It was essentially a cheap and fast way to get rid of a car rather than go through a sort of more complex sale process. And we felt it was somewhat of a cheap name as a consequence of that. But we went with it. And actually we refer to the business as AUFI, which is the acronym AUFI. And you'll notice, a little plug of the website here, but AUFI.com is the actual website. And that was us sort of trying to hide the fact we were called Ask Us for Ideas initially. And it was only when we went to our own first the branding exercise with an agency that they said, "Out of interest, what does AUFI stand for?" And we said, "Oh, it stands for Ask Us for Ideas." And they were like, "That's brilliant. I mean, why wouldn't you shout about that?" And that was the turning point for us. That was the moment we realized that actually we landed on a really strong name. And once someone else had sort of validated it for us, the connotation of we buy any car sort of disappeared. So we've gallantly moved forward with it as our name.
I love that. I think of there's webuyhouses.com, take away the
flowers and all that.
Yeah. It's interesting you said that you and your co-founder joke that you wish there was a better story, and yet you went and told what I think was a pretty good story about those early days. So when you talk about the fit between brand and agency, that's another thing that's pretty tricky. How do you define a perfect fit?
Yeah, it's really the whole reason we exist. Ultimately, we launched this business back in 2011. So next year will actually be our 15th birthday. Can you believe it? And at that
Happy
time,
15th birthday, Offie.
Thank you very much. And at the time, the sort of agency landscape was probably going through its biggest transformation ever, and it has continued to transform and transforms even today in terms of stuff I'm sure we'll discuss at some point in this podcast. Uh, but the long reality has always been that the right agency partnership has the ability to transform or catapult or solve any challenge for a business. The challenge is it's much easier to get wrong than it is right, and as a consequence, you hear the "I don't like agencies. I got burnt by an agency," and it wasn't the fact that agencies are bad; it was ultimately that the wrong agency was selected, and that in part comes down, we think, to not enough emphasis or consideration being put on the element of finding an agency rather than just diving into the work with an agency. And the reality is that is often because people are trying to pick agencies at a very fast pace because they need to do something by a certain time. And so they jump into Google or more recently ChatGPT to get recommendations for agencies. The challenge with that is while those engines are phenomenal and I would never try and compete with them, they lack they don't ask questions or they don't ponder as to why they're recommending that agency. They just recommend based on whatever the algorithm suggests they should recommend. So what we try and do is we use our knowledge of the agency landscape and the curated network of agencies that we've built very strong relationships with and never have very detailed understanding of, to ask questions of a client around, how have you arrived at this point? What are you really looking to achieve? What does success look like? How do you operate as a company internally? And how do you like to operate with external partners? And what does that mean to the type of agency and the relationship you want to have with them? So we really tried to get into the understanding the kind of the goals and the complications of the work rather than just the sort of surface level needs. And I think if people can go into, or brands can go into the process of being really aligned internally as to what is the sort of external point of view or the external set of skills and capabilities that you really need to complement or challenge your own, then that sets them up for what I call the head and the heart test. And I think picking the right agency, or when you've picked the right agency, or when the relationship has the best chance of success, when both your head and your heart feel really good about the decision. Because the reality is, if you go just with your head and it's very tick boxy and practical, you'll get a perfectly fine thing, but it might not have the impact it could have. If you go with just your heart, you might get something wildly exciting that excites you, but doesn't potentially achieve the things you set out to achieve. And so I think, it's pretty basic and not particularly complex. But if the agency you can be really clear that, yes, this makes sense. This is why we're doing this. These are the really important things we need to achieve. And these are the skill sets that we don't possess, not just the ones that we like the sound of what they're saying and it excites us, but they really are going to solve the challenge we need. And simultaneously, you're just really excited by their personalities, their experience, the way they see the world, the way they see your problem, their past work. I think if those two things collide, and that's what we try and help people to find, then you have every chance of a really, not just a great relationship for that project, but a relationship can grow. And that's where the real impact can be in terms of a long-term agency relationship.
So, as you talk about the need for a process, is there an easy way to describe start to finish what that process of agency selection should look like?
It's hard to fit. I'd say it's hard to fit everyone into the same bucket because companies are so different. And part of the joy of what we do is we work with a 2-person small startup, and then we work with a global business, and we work on both ends of the spectrum. And very little connects those two companies apart from them simultaneously find themselves at this inflection point where they know they need or feel they would benefit from an external perspective. But I would say, despite what end of that spectrum you are, big company to small company, whether you're a B2B company or B2C company, I think internal alignment, the first thing is internal. It's important that the key stakeholders are aligned internally as to what this project is about, and what you're trying to achieve and what does success look like. From there, you can create a pretty good brief that shares the sort of overview of where the company is at, what you're looking to achieve and what success looks like, and any parameters within which, or any sort of things that it's important for an agency to know in order to work with them. That can all be laid out and be quite clear. And I think that brief, it serves two purposes. One, it's the platform for a great conversation with an agency. And it's in those great conversations that you start to build a rapport and an understanding of how an agency operates. But it can also act as, while a brief never needs to be sort of so rigid that it can't adapt or evolve, within it, you should still maintain ultimately, whether the solution to something is driven by deliverables or driven by an outcome, the goals and the things that are important and the things that you must find, that brief can still act as a sort of guiding set of principles to you as you go through the process of meeting an agency and ultimately selecting a decision. And then beyond that, as much as you have resource and capacity for, and as much as is sensible, as much time you can spend with an agency, getting to know them, just even down to the way they communicate between meetings, the way they the speed at which they respond sometimes, or the way they set up a meeting or end a meeting, or communicate in between, all those little details to the macro ones, to the micro ones. The more you get to know an agency through the process of them ultimately trying to win your piece of work, and or you trying to win their attention, and I think it should be a more balanced. The best relationship is where there is a real desire on both ends of the spectrum to work with one another, not one or the other necessarily. I think that's the really important piece. Basically, those are the important elements.
On Brand will be right back after this. Now back to the show. You mentioned relationships earlier, and I have to think, being in this very unique business, that you're making relationship references on the regular. So, for those listening out there, what are the red flags that you might not be in a good relationship?
Yes, you're right. The sort of relationship sort of metaphors come sort of flowing
Yeah.
sometimes, and dating, all that kind of stuff. It's quite natural to lead into that. I think what are the red flags? I think one I'd always lean back to is, I think if you're chasing something, it's unlikely to work out. I think it's natural potentially sometimes to chase after a certain agency because they did a piece of work, and they find themselves, maybe there's compromises on both sides for the relationship to start. Maybe one's spending more money than they want to spend, and one's having to do it for less than they'd like to charge for. And even though that can work out, it's not impossible. I'm not suggesting that. I think that imbalance can, where there's already cracks, it's hard for those cracks not to widen at some point. I think ultimately it's, it's somewhat cliched, but like trust and respect and really frank and honest communication, and being and communication, like in anything, you're going back to relationship conversations here, communication is so important. And I think, that's why I always say to both client and agency, again, I go back to a bit what I was talking about earlier, that the process of finding an agency should be a trial run for what it's like to work with one another. And I think in that process, you've got to lay all your cards on the table, and you've got to set the stall out that, you can both be frank and honest with each other, and clear feedback is going to be vital to this process. And so I think, if you're finding yourself on either side of the table holding back information because you're worried about upsetting that person, or it's like at some point in this process, you're going to see something you don't like, and either you're going to have to tell them that, or it's going to rear its ugly head somewhere late in the process. So I think it's, somewhat cliched, but I think that it's true. That it is such a relationship business. You don't have to be. The one thing I don't want that to sort of mix that with is, I'm not suggesting, sometimes there's the old cliche, you should be able to go down to the pub with them and have a drink. And I think that's a bit far. You don't have to be best mates with these people. You talk about, I'm a big sports nut. I don't know about yourself, but you sometimes talk to, or you hear ex-players from team sports talk about the relationships they had with the players they played with, and they sometimes had incredible relationships on the pitch. but that didn't mean they were best friends off the pitch. And I think that's a good analogy for it. I think it's wrong to say you've got to be able to go down, I would say the pub, but whatever the equivalent is in the States, and have a drink with them. You don't have to be best friends, but I think there's got to be a real sense of respect, trust, good communication, etc.
Well, boy, like you said, the relationship metaphors and analogy, it's unavoidable because it's the same way that a good relationship of any kind doesn't look like what you might get served up in the Instagram algorithm, that it's always public displays of affection, that it's always one thing, that it looks a certain way. So yeah, very, very different there.
Yeah, and I'm just to finish on it, you know, the process of working between a client and agency, tension points can be really good and really valuable in the process. But you've got to be able to find those tension points and be able to have sensible conversation and work through them together. And the problem is if someone goes into a relationship with the slightest of doubt that an agency is the right person, the moment a crack forms, they'll see that as a reason to end the relationship, or it didn't work out for whatever reason, rather than saying, okay, this is a really good opportunity for us to move forward, and we can work through this together, and there's positives that can come from this. So yeah, having the strength in the relationship to work through those moments is vital.
So years ago, I was a very, 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 very small agency co-owner, and I know that the agency business over the past couple of decades has expanded, contracted, shifted, digital, social, hybrid, AI enablement. It was tricky enough before, and it's not, oh, now we've gotten to this plateau and it's easy to understand. So as a sort of matchmaker of agencies, when the agency landscape is going through so many shifts, how do you make the best connections and know what's right?
It's a good question. We're and I'm forever talking about the sort of spread of skills and capabilities and new ones transpiring, and the way certain platforms work completely shift overnight, and people having to adapt to that. And again, I go back to the sort of origin story of us. The reason, not only was the sort of agency landscape in 2011 going through a period of change via the fact that all the sort of best and some of the top talent within big networks was going to set up their own small agencies. What you also saw was the proliferation of different agency capabilities and skills and specialisms, and that's what allowed a business like ours to exist, and where we found the opportunity to exist. We have part of our team of 12 is the network team, and the network team work all week on kind of maintaining relationships with the network, mapping the network, onboarding new agencies that in a very strategic manner that fill gaps within the network, that cater to certain types of projects or needs, or as new skills arrive, how do we make sure we have the very best people in those areas? And part of the work they do is to have, quarterly catch-ups with each of these agencies. Each of these meetings they then record, and we have a meeting, a fortnightly meeting called Agency Hour, where they present back to the wider team here the conversations they've had and what they've learned about how this agency is adapting in this new era, who they're hiring, what they're passionate about, what the type of projects they want to be working on. So we have this ever growing sort of database of both sort of practical information, but also anecdotal information that we leverage when we're talking to clients and understanding what is it, the sort of specialism, the sort of unique understanding of a certain type of audience or how a certain platform works, that we can make sure, okay, well, we know that agency over here has been heads down in this new platform for the last year, and they've hired someone who previously sat client side within an organization that was very successful in this area, and they're bringing that knowledge to the table. And that, I go back to the sort of the reason, the value that we bring is for someone to, it's sort of in some degree, I hate to use the word moat, but you hear about it in business and technology. I don't believe there's any individual CMO or chief digital officer or head of brand that in the space that they need to find an agency to deliver a piece of work amongst all the other plates they're spinning within their day job could get us up to date, detailed understanding of not just a 10,000 foot view of the agency landscape and a 10,000 foot view of the very best within each of those specialisms, but each agency on a one-to-one basis. If they wanted to do that, they'd have to spend a year trying to find an agency really to get up to that speed. And that's that's the knowledge that we want to bring to clients on a project by project basis to help them really quickly in a way that is, helps them. It's not intimidating, that helps them wade through all the noise and everything else that's going on agency websites and Google and ChatGPT to really understand, okay, this is the agency that really knows what they're talking about in this area. So it is no other science than we spend the time to get to know these agencies and to continue to get to know them. And that's really the secret behind it. Is not nothing more complex than that. But I take my hat off to Shah and Beth, who are the agency network team here, who are the real drivers of that in the company.
Do you have a favorite success story that you point to where the right agency match really transformed a brand's outcome?
A lot. It's a bit. Picking between my favorite children, I'd say. We're so lucky in the sense that we do about 300 deals a year. To give it some volume. So we work, and I mentioned earlier just the sheer diversity of client that we work with, from a small company who's trying to bring a large brand to market, to a company that's putting shipping containers in space so that people can access storage within 90 minutes from anywhere in the world, and everything in between. And the joy in our business is that diversity. And one of the things that we've always tried to maintain as we've grown is, yes, we always want to work on the big projects, the ones that really great work gets done and gets put out there and everyone talks about. But our route has always been in also supporting the companies right at the beginning of their journeys. We have dabbled in the sort of world of venture, and we will always try our best to support the smallest of companies who are doing new things in a way that in the future, I'm sure we will support them again as they become bigger companies. And it's the breadth of working on both those projects that also adds the value I think we can bring to clients. But I will tell you one quick story that I think is a good one. And certainly a pivotal moment. One of the pivotal moments in our journey was the company Brewdog. I don't know, are you aware of Brewdog? It's a very well-known British brewery or beer company, ultimately, that were one of the first craft sort of punk breweries in the UK that really disrupted the sort of the beer landscape. And they had been known for many years as the punk brand. They were the sort of, they did the things typical beer companies can do, and they were very punky, and they shouted about being punk, and one of their beers was called Punk IPA. And they came to us at a point where they were, distribution was large, they were across retail, they had many, many SKUs, and the issue for them was the brand had lost any sort of visual language within its brand world, because there were just so many products. They'd all been like branded and created in isolation at that moment in time. And so they came to us to sort of, as they were expanding into retail, how do they tighten that language up, basically, and take the brands to the next level. And we introduced them to a series of agencies, and we put one agency in the mix, which on paper, if you looked at those two agencies, if you looked at Brewdog and the agency, you just would never put them together. Brewdog was like loud and brash and, everything this agency wasn't, which was very refined, sophisticated, real love for sort of nuance and detail and beautiful design. But we knew from that agency that they were really, really keen to do something in the world of CPG. And they really wanted to bring their sort of very considered design lens to the world of CPG. And so we said, look, this could go one of two ways, but I think it's worth having a conversation, because by design, you are the beer company that doesn't act like any other beer company. And these guys have never worked in beer before. And so they'll, it's a continual, you could go to a load of agencies that have done loads of beer before, and do you just end up being, somewhat similar to the other beer brands because you go through the mechanism of working with a company that's worked on loads of beer. And it ended up being both the client and the agency sort of fought the meeting even happening in the first place, but we kind of convinced them to do so. And then they went on, and it was like love at first sight when they actually got talking to each other. And the agency really pitched them on the idea of, today you shout the fact that you're punk, but a true punk would never talk about the fact they were punk. They would just stand for things that they really care about in the world. They wouldn't shout about being punk. They would just be punk ultimately. And that just like caught the founders' attention. And they went on, I think it was a multi-year relationship which was just meant to be about designing a can or creating a consistent design language across cans, to completely redoing the brand architecture from top to bottom, the whole strategy into campaigns and activations and everything else. So it's not all of them are like that, but it's a story we talk about from time to time. But there's many others, so I don't want to pick one, but there's many others. There is one there.
Well, that story of that relationship certainly makes me smile. I am going to make you pick a brand that has made you smile recently, Toby.
Good question. I think I'm going to go for a brand that we actually haven't worked with, that is part of my life outside of the day-to-day, which is a company called Mindful Chef, which is a meal kit delivery company in the UK. They send you the ingredients for a particular meal, you cook it at home, etc., etc. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And they're one of many, and I'm sure the others are equally good. But I'm at the stage of my life now. I've got 2 kids. I go home. I'm more conscious at my age now of what I eat. I think we all are naturally. And Mindful Chef, the quality of the food, the flavors, the things it gets me to cook that I'd never cooked before. It's something my wife and I do almost every night together when we're at home. The kids are in bed. We get to do this. It's part of our ritual, our routine in the evening. And we eat the most wonderful meals. I feel like I'm eating food that's good for me, that's, produced in the right ways, that's sourced in the right ways. And yeah, it constantly makes me smile for that reason. So I'm going to give a shout out to the team at Mindful Chef for the way they make me feel.
I love that. Now, you mentioned it earlier, but let's tell folks again where they can go to learn more about who you are and what you do.
Well, we have our website, which is aufi.com. So that's Ask Us for Ideas, the acronym aufi.com. We have within that, there's stuff about what we do and how the projects we've been involved with. It always drives me mad. It's a fraction of what we've done, and I wish we could share it all more, but that's a sort of general founder issue, I think. We have a podcast, our own podcast called Private Views, where we interview various people on both sides of the client side and on the agency side. We have a Substack. We have various insights on our website. Lots to learn about us, but yeah, would love to speak to and meet anyone and talk about what we do. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about that.
Awesome. Well, we will link up to that in our show notes, which folks can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Toby Wilkinson, thanks for being on brand with us.
It's been a pleasure, Nick. Thank you for having me.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.